Hi, everyone. Thank you for being here today. My name is Tom Graves. I'm here to welcome you to what will be a highly informative discussion on the importance of news in the conflict zone, which might include civil unrest, natural disasters, or the actual combat as we're seeing now in Ukraine. This panel is a collaboration of the California State Library and the Joe Rosenthal Chapter of the U.S. Marine Corps Combat Correspondents Association. For those of you who don't know, Joe Rosenthal took the iconic flag-raising photo on Iwo Jima in 1945 in the midst of that World War II battle. His Pulitzer Prize-winning photo became not only the most famous example of wartime photography, it became the most recognized and reproduced photo in history. Our chapter's mission is to share the legacy of Rosenthal and his photo with the public and to name a U.S. Navy warship in his honor. You can help with that effort by signing a petition at ussjoe.org. Today's panel should all give us a renewed appreciation for the journalists who put themselves in harm's way to get the news to us. Excuse me, and we hope the discussion will help keep those journalists safe. We're recording the panel today, and the recording will be posted later on the library's YouTube channel so people can watch it in the future. Please put your questions today in the chat, and the panel will answer as many of them as possible. Let me introduce our panelists alphabetically. Julio Cortez is a staff photographer for the Associated Press based in Baltimore. He was part of the 2021 Pulitzer Prize-winning team of AP photographers who covered the national protests following the George Floyd's murder. One of Julio's outstanding photos showed a man with an American flag, a photo as powerful as Joe Rosenthal's. Most recently, he covered the events of January 6th at the US Capitol, and he'll talk a little bit about that today. Julio is an immigrant from Mexico who has wanted to be a journalist since he was 12 years old. He introduced himself to me as a sports photographer, but I think you'll see he's faced many dangerous situations doing his job as a photojournalist. Nicole Frugé is the director of visuals at the San Francisco Chronicle, where she leads one of the most diverse metro staffs in the nation. She was named the Jim Gordon Photo Editor of the Year in 2019, Photo Editor of the Year in 2018, and the Chronicle's photo editors were twice named the Picture Editing Team of the Year by the National Press Photographers Association. Before photo editing, Nicole spent 10 years as a staff photographer for newspapers in Texas and in Florida, for whom she covered the war in Iraq, Hurricane Katrina, as well as long-term documentary stories for the San Antonio Express News. Lucy Westcott is director of the Committee to Protect Journalists Emergencies Department, where she oversees CPJs assistance and safety work worldwide. In 2021, she played a prominent role in CPJ's response to the Afghan crisis, including helping evacuate Afghan journalists and their families. Prior to CPJ, Lucy was a staff writer for a number of publications, including Newsweek and The Atlantic, and was United Nations correspondent for the Interpress Service. She's written about gender and development in South Africa and Lesotho, and has reported from Egypt, Jordan, Cameroon, and the US. She has a master's in multi-platform journalism from the University of Maryland and a bachelor's degree from the University of Sussex in the UK. Our moderator today is Lauren Katzenberg, editor at the New York Times International Desk. She's now covering Latin America and previously oversaw the Times coverage of reporting in Afghanistan. Lauren joined the Times in 2018 as the editor of the At War channel, where she oversaw a range of journalism from first-person accounts written by military veterans, combat correspondents, and refugees to in-depth enterprise reporting. She was previously the managing editor of Task and Purpose, a digital publication that she helped found covering military and veteran issues, something I subscribe to, by the way. She was also part of the original editorial team of War on the Rocks, a foreign policy web magazine. Lauren moved to Kabul in 2010, where she produced television and radio shows in Dari and Pashto. She then completed a master's degree in London at the School of Oriental and African Studies. So that's our panel, and I'll now turn it over to Lauren.
Thanks, Tom. So since we first started planning this panel, we have seen Russian forces carry out a full-scale invasion of Ukraine, which is the largest ground war in Europe since World War II. More than 2 million Ukrainians have fled the country and thousands have been killed and injured. Major independent media outlets in Russia have been shut down. International news organizations are being forced to pull their reporters out of the country, while correspondents in Ukraine are operating under terrifying conditions. We know that at least one journalist has been killed in the fighting and several more have been shot and wounded. So I can't imagine a more humbling time to have this conversation. I just want to thank the Joe Rosenthal Chapter of the USMC Combat Correspondents Association and the California State Library for making this panel possible. We have a lot of ground to cover today, so I want to go straight to Lucy to tell us a little bit about her work, and then we'll have a short presentation from Nicole and from Julio, and then we'll get into some questions with each of the panelists.
Thank you so much, Lauren, and thank you so much for everyone for being here today. I'm going to give you a brief overview of what we at CPJ have seen so far as we've just entered the third week of this war. So we are responding as the Committee to Protect Journalists to journalists at risk on multiple fronts. We of course have Ukrainian journalists reporting from inside Ukraine on the war that is happening inside their own country. There are many journalists who are internally displaced. So they are moving from one part of the country to a safer part. And as of yet, we have not encountered so many journalists who are fleeing Ukraine as they are choosing to stay and cover the war. We of course also have international journalists who are inside of Ukraine. And there have been several very terrifying, high profile instances of the dreadful threats and risks that they have faced while reporting. I'm sure many people here have seen the video from Sky News and the team that was reporting from outside of Kyiv and the gunfire that they came under. International correspondent Stuart Ramsey was shot and is thankfully in stable and good condition. But that video really does show the terrifying risks that reporting during this conflict right now can bring to journalists. There are several other examples, and of course Lauren brought up Yevgeny Sakun. He is a cameraman. He is the first confirmed death of a journalist during this war. He was killed after the Russian shelling of the Kyiv TV tower last week. So journalists who have gone into Ukraine to report face risks, and I can talk more about those in a bit. But I want to also remind everyone that there is a Russian component to this war as well. There's Russian journalists who face now, due to a new law, up to 15 years in prison for reporting on the war, for using the word war or invasion. They face fines for doing so as well. So as one Russian journalist put to me earlier this week, and this journalist is now out of the country, independent media in Russia is essentially dead, which is a terrifying prospect. Additionally, the kind of third aspect to all of this is Belarusian journalists who fled to Ukraine to seek asylum and safety from the autocratic regime they were living in, and have now been exiled for a second time, now having fled the war. So we are dealing with many crises on top of each other in this entire conflict. The way that CPJ can help and the way that we are planning to help is we can give financial grants and assistance to journalists in emergency situations. And of course, this absolutely is an emergency situation. So we're working on that. We also provide some comprehensive safety information to journalists in Ukraine in many languages. We got quite a head start on this and translated all the information we needed. But I know that there's many journalists in Ukraine who have suddenly had to become war correspondents inside of their own country. They went from covering business or local affairs or politics to suddenly covering a war. And as many people here know, that takes a bit of training and a bit of knowledge as well. So I think I'll leave it there for now. But just to reiterate the fact that there are many different crises rolled into one here. Thank you.
Nicole, do you want to take over and show us the photos that you're sharing with the panel today?
Sure thing. Let me share my screen with you guys. You guys see this? Is that working for everybody?
Yeah.
Oh, great. Well, thank you so much for having me today. It is a really, difficult time to be talking about this, but also a really important time to be talking about this. I think, many of us have, friends that we know that are in the Ukraine right now, and it's definitely incredibly nerve-wracking. Hoping that everyone comes back safe, and it's just a really sad time for the folks in the Ukraine. I'm going to try to show these pictures fairly quickly so we can get into the more of a discussion, but I just wanted to sort of set a little groundwork about myself and my background. It's a little unusual. I started as a photographer, and now I'm on the editing side of things. And I'm sort of an accidental conflict photographer. Most people think of it as glamorous, and there's war movies about photographers and that sort of thing. And I basically became a conflict photographer because I failed at a photo assignment pretty greatly, which was the photo assignment you don't want to fail at, which was on September 11th. I was in the room as a young photographer when George Bush got the news that the second plane attacked the World Trade Center, and I was in the local pool and had no idea about the first plane. And so I missed the shot, and that drove me to become really interested in the war as the ramp up to the war happened, and really felt compelled to try to tell soldier stories during that time and sort of make up for my, to use military parlance, massive foobar as a young journalist. So I went to Iraq as an embedded journalist. I covered a lot of stuff for San Antonio, where I was stateside covering funerals and folks coming back to the hospital for treatment for several, I think maybe a year and a half before I actually went to war with the Texas troops. And I did it because I felt like I was basically on the tail end of the story as opposed to getting to tell a full story. Being an embed is not really getting to tell a full story, and we can talk more about that. It's certainly, I'm seeing I saw what the American military wanted me to see to a certain extent. And so, I definitely was pretty determined and pushy to see as much as possible, but there is a framing that happens based on the embed structure that we can talk a little bit about, I think. And, it's a really tricky thing because, right now, I think the military reporters and editors are petitioning the US for, the possibility of even having embed. So it's, despite the fact that I had a somewhat restricted view, I did have a view and an ability to tell those soldier stories. And, the government can change their mind at any time and change the rules so that journalists do not have access to tell these kinds of soldier stories. This is really important. So as a photojournalist, I was really interested in connecting with the American soldiers, but also finding ways to are you guys seeing the full picture? I just realized that there's on the right hand of this frame, there's some Iraqi soldiers eating in a different room than the US military. And I was really fascinated by the different experiences and how, even though I had this kind of limited ability to see the Iraqi side of the story, in areas that I could see the intersection, how I could show how different their experiences were. And that became really important to me to tell the story in ways that I could. And then when I came back stateside, I was doing like several months in Iraq, and then I would do normal dailies, like a regular photographer. Sometimes I would shoot sports, but not as well as Julio, Friday night football and that sort of thing. But mainly my passion was getting back to Iraq as much as possible and trying to find stories that would carry over back in the States so I could have that full circle experience. So I met a soldier named Daniel Barnes in the hospital in Balad after he had lost both of his legs, and followed his story. And this is when I think, the work became a little bit richer and, less a patchwork quilt of trying to tell a story, but to be able to tell a full story. And I followed Daniel back home to Texas with his family as he struggled to be able to walk. His amputations were above the knee, so it was incredibly difficult for him to get adjusted to the prosthetics. And as a matter of fact, now 10 years later, he's still working towards being comfortable standing as opposed to being in a wheelchair. Sports and camaraderie became incredibly important to him as he recovered. And the most interesting thing to me was that I feel like this is the best picture that I made from this experience, which was Daniel with his kids. And he, the main thing that he kept saying to me over and over again as I would talk to him is that all he cared about was that he got to come home to his kids. And it didn't matter, the loss of the legs didn't matter. What mattered is that he was alive. And so I thought, I went to a war zone, but I made my most, powerful picture when he was sitting down watching Grey's Anatomy on TV in a suburban house. And, how war is not just about the conflict zone, war is about what happens at home. And so Daniel and his family picked up and moved back to Missouri, where he was stationed before the war, after his recovery. And they got their dream home, and a nosy neighbor asked them, how much did this house cost you? And Daniel said 2 legs. And so that's that military soldier humor, is part of like what got him through. So, after doing that work for about 10 years, I, as a photographer, you're a, one-man band. It's really you and the people you're photographing, and that's your responsibility. I became really interested in having an impact and working with a team. And that's when I decided to become an editor. And so now I'm at San Francisco Chronicle, leading this amazing, diverse team that, is way more talented than I was as a photographer. And I get to have a different kind of impact. And it's a much bigger, larger kind of collaborative impact instead of being sort of a one horse kind of affair. As a photojournalist, I really valued my independence, but as a editor, I really value being able to help build this team. And so the biggest parallel, I think, in conflict photography and what I took from it is leading our wildfire coverage, which has become nearly year-round now. And in the time that I've been an editor, we've covered more fires than I can count. And, a lot of what we learned in terms of tactical awareness and being safe in the field I think does definitely translate and helps me figure out the logistics for our team. So these are some of the fires. This is from the campfire. The earlier ones were from the Tubbs fire, and this fire in Big Sur. Santa Mejia's time exposure, which is very cool, from the Kincaid fire. And then climate change, you know, as a result of these fires, you know, sometimes it's not the flames, but it's the impact on people. And this is Jessica Christian's photo from Orange Sky Day, when the whole Bay Area looked like a, you know, apocalyptic nightmare for a day. And then the most recent fire from Carlos Gonzalez, and down below Alvin Jornada found a guy fiddling with in the middle of the fire, which just reminded me of Nero. It was kind of amazing. The other issue where we're using a lot of the experience that I had in the conflict zone is COVID-19 and preparation for that. And so, you know, we've had to really adapt how we lead the team, giving folks more time off to prepare, you know, taking care of people's emotional health and making sure they stay safe and they're in the right equipment is super important. This is Gabrielle Lurie, all decked out in a hospital. And then protests, other big thing. This is a shot from Sarah Beth Manny, one of our interns. The protests of 2020 coincided with the pandemic. So we had an intern who shot this incredible picture, but while she was supposed to be quarantining. You know, that's one of the things is, you know, as a young journalist, I was just like Sarah Beth, and no one would have told me to quarantine when there was, you know, big news happening. And she, you know, my head explodes as an editor, but as a young photographer, I would have been right there with her. And so navigating those sorts of things has been really interesting, you know, prioritizing the safety of the team, but also recognizing the ambition and drive to tell these stories that are super important. So this was an incredibly complex time for us because we had to make sure that folks in these mass events at the height of COVID-19 were safe, but also documenting the story. And then trying to tell a less, you know, fiery version of the story. Who are the people who are impacted by these events, and less about damage and more about the impact that these major events have on folks. That was from Yoshi James, amazing photographer. These are a couple of past protest pictures. Obviously, you know, as Bush was running for election, there are a lot of really violent protests that turned really ugly. This gentleman brought a knife to a protest. Noah Berger, one of our freelancers, captured this photo. Our staff photographer at the time, Leah Millis, was a few feet away from this guy. This was a moment that crystallized that, you know, the Trump years were going to be completely different, and we had to really think about how we were covering protests and when we were going to cover protests. It was a pretty pivotal time. And then finally, the other major issue is covering homelessness and drug use in San Francisco, which is a complete epidemic and incredibly dangerous for our photographers because they're dealing with a lot of high crime, and it's you know, they become targets in these open air drug markets, and that's something we talk a little more about too. This is from our series on fentanyl deaths, which Stephen Lamb shot for us. And again, trying to get to the heart of the story, not just shooting the high impact moments, but you know, who is facing the toll of these really powerful, important stories. Gabrielle Lurie. This is a story again, like trying to take the big issue, and you know, first you see the high impact stories that set like what is the policy, what is the issue, but then going into intimate stories that really illustrate the people who are affected by this. This is a mother who tried to compensate her daughter from fentanyl addiction. She flew in from Washington, or actually drove in and tried to get her daughter into rehab. And the pull of the drug is just so hard that she was unable to do it. And these are Gabrielle Lurie's pictures. And wound up leaving unsuccessful, which is just, not a happy ending, but where, how difficult fentanyl addiction is for folks to get over. Thank you so much for hearing me out. This is Jessica, who's still on the streets, and Gabrielle's still photographing.
Thanks, Nicole.
I'll
That was a
stop
great
sharing.
presentation. I'm going to hand it over to you, Julio.
Sure. Thanks for having me. First of all, it was mentioned a little bit ago. I'm more of a sports photographer than anything else. I think my job is 70% sports, and so to be part of this panel, it's super. It's humbling and also very inspiring to be among y'all, because you are doing it the way I would love to do it. But part of me being here is I did wind up being part of coverage that was very aggressive, violent, and just scary overall. And so and I'm going to show you some pictures and just to show you what it was like for me on the ground, both at Minneapolis and on January 6th on the steps of the Capitol. And I really think the pictures speak for themselves. So let me just show you that now. You should be seeing my George Floyd stuff now. And so I'm based in Baltimore, and I got called early in the morning to fly out to Minneapolis because something was going on over there. And of course, I knew exactly what was going on. I've been watching the news for 2 days now and seeing the content that mostly the Minneapolis Star Tribune photographers were creating. And I was so inspired and just in awe for a few days watching their work, in particularly that of Carlos Gonzalez, who's a dear friend of mine, and seeing his images, I was super proud of him and also super scared for him because it did not look safe. Needless to say, I land in Minneapolis about 3 p.m. and this image was shot maybe 5 p.m. I mean, I've only been in Minneapolis once for a couple of days, so I had to hit the ground running. So first thing I did with my partner, John Minkillo, who's a staff photographer with the AP in New York, was we headed over to St. Paul because Carlos had mentioned that there was some sort of activity there that was worth looking at. So this is among the very first photos I encountered getting there. So I shot protests, but not this level. A lot of protests in New York City when I was a staffer in New Jersey, and just a little bit about safety. When I was working protest in Newark, New Jersey, I actually got attacked several times. One of them, which was the most scary one, I was doing a walkout with high school students, and somebody, I never saw him, punch me in the back of the head, and I dropped, and I had to go into protect mode. And when that happened, I had to figure out where was my escape route. Luckily, I knew exactly where I was, and I knew that there was a federal building just down the street. So when I got up and was able to kind of get on my feet and safe, I started running towards the federal building and screaming at the marshals as I was walking next to the protest. So that was, I guess, the scariest, but not the stuff that I saw in Minneapolis. So we get there and we're seeing all this stuff just as it's developing, and for me, I'm really shaking my boots because I've never seen so much smoke. I've never seen so much anger and particularly from the police. They were just kind of spraying everybody. It didn't matter, if you're just a bystander or pressed or protester, you were definitely attacked. So I had to go into protect mode much faster than I would have liked. I wished I would have had more time to kind of collect myself, but here I was right in the middle of it. But just as we were photographing everything in St. Paul, we hear that the 3rd precinct in Minneapolis is being evacuated by the cops, and protesters are starting to come into the precinct. So we get in our cars and head over there. And sure enough, at the minute we get there, it is just mayhem, for lack of a better word. Just it was very dark, and the only source of light was mostly the fires that were heavily engulfing the buildings. And I recognized some of the areas because I had seen it on the images and on TV. But it still took me a couple of seconds or a couple of minutes to figure out exactly where I was and what we were doing. So John and I tried to stay together as much as possible so that we can watch each other's back, which we did. But at some point we decided, okay, let's split out for 15 minutes and meet back at the spot, and we did. So I went off and made this picture. He went out and made some beautiful pictures of protesters standing on a ledge, together with the police precinct in the background, just in flames. And not long after that, we met up, and he and I decided to go up into the building and up to the roof of the police department, which to me, initially it was not a great idea. When he told me, you want to go up there, and I said no, and he asked me again, but in a more of a directive way. He was like, we're gonna go up, right? And so I said, all right, we're gonna go up. And so we're up there, and I'm just thinking, this is a scene out of a movie, because when in America are the cops ditching their post, and all of a sudden media and protesters are going through the building, no problem. So we did that, came down, and not long after that, right at 11:59 p.m. with 38 seconds, I took this picture, which to my surprise was very well received across the world. Immediately, I started getting a bunch of messages from people saying, this is a great picture. And just a little bit of background on how I handle these situations. I normally don't tell my parents I'm going to a difficult situation. Mostly I like to do the phone call where I'm like, hey, guess what? I just jumped out of another plane. It's my 3rd time. Like, we're good. Like, it's over. Like, I'm safe. And I wanted to do that with this assignment as well. But I went to sleep at about 3 a.m. This morning, feeling like I've done my job. And I woke up at 7 ready to start a new day. And my social media is just crazy with this picture and people giving it a lot of comments saying that they feel connection to it. So for me, my cover was blown, so I had to call my parents and say, you might see some pictures from Minneapolis, and I'm here, but I'm safe. So unfortunately, that was part of the the back end of that, but I was just so happy the way the images were received, specifically that one. And here's a couple more that kind of transpired over the next couple of days of my coverage in Minneapolis. And for 3 nights straight for us, it was very difficult. The night that this photo was taken, this is a building that's around the corner from our hotel. And when the company made plans for us to go to Minneapolis, they said, you know, the reporter in town said, we're going to put you up in this hotel. It's quite a bit of a distance from where the 3rd precinct is, but you're close enough where you can get to things quickly. Well, we didn't know that it was going to be so close. Eventually, a couple hours after this picture was taken, we had to ditch the hotel, and in a convoy of mostly AP staffers, TV reporters, photographers, and a couple other colleagues from other companies. We just ditched the hotel to get to a hotel near the airport, a little bit further out, but safer. So that's kind of what we were contending at the moment. Same night, but and this was just kind of a warm up for lack of a better word, because the next day was when it was really hectic. The cops in the state were really looking down to clamp down and stop the protesters, and particularly the people that were violating curfew. So on Saturday, the 31st, they came out like this, and it's by far the most violent event I've ever seen as a journalist. This is where Carolyn Cole from the LA Times got injured in the eye. Ed Wu, a videographer for NBC, got hit dead in the forehead by a bullet. And so it was very difficult to cover this because they were coming at us, at everybody. It wasn't just the protesters. So we were able to work together. And the great thing about that I learned about this situation was this day I saw and I heard, particularly from Lucas Jackson, who was at Reuters at the time, said, this is how we operate in a war zone. We stay together. Even though we're competing, we are staying together. And I learned that lesson, and I kept it very close to my heart, and I continue to use that in scary situations now. You know, I will not go anywhere by myself anymore. So here's a couple more pictures of that. After that day, things got a little calmer. There was a couple more protests. This is the following night, but not as bad. This was a small cluster at a street corner, and a couple more images from that night. But I was pretty shaken after that happened, and it's just, for me, it made me a different journalist to be able to cover this. A little bit of background, kind of like Nicole. For me, I was my goal was to be a reporter. Particularly, I wanted to do sports reporting. I wanted to be a beat writer covering the Los Angeles Dodgers. But when I was in junior college, September 11 happened, and I saw the images from Getty, AP. One particular stands out, the picture from Suzanne Plunkett of a man very much dressed like me with the white shirt and a tie and a backpack running away from the buildings. And so for me, that made me become a photographer. I said, I want to record history as it happens. And so, just as we, say in our normal vocabulary now, which is say September 11, now, January 6th is that. And so, almost 20 years to the date, here I am covering essentially the most historical event in our country. And I happened to be there once again, standing next to John McKillow, he and I really kind of made it a point to stick together and have a game plan and just talk about how we're going to get away from things should they get crazy. So we talked about exit strategies and how to communicate with each other. There's a lot of I have a lot of GoPro video, and there's a lot of them where you see each other just kind of like pointing at each other, like saying, all right, I got eyes on you. Okay, cool. Like that's all we needed to do to keep going. And even though that day, that third day in Minneapolis felt like the scariest, most violent event in my lifetime and my career, 6 months later, I'm now at the steps of the Capitol, and seeing yet another. And this one really shook me because for 10 or 12 hours, I kept on hearing people saying that they were going to murder me just because I had a camera on me. So it really shook me, and seeing the violence that was happening in front of me really kind of made me question my whether I wanted to continue to be a journalist, and it's the only time in my career that I've ever texted my wife and said, pray for me because this is bad. And normally I'm just like, it's cool, we're good, I'm getting lunch, I'm getting coffee. This time it was pray for us because it's getting really ugly. And so that I couldn't even believe that I wrote that. Like it was very selfish of me to say that to my wife and scare her, but I had no idea who to go to. I was so scared. And so luckily we got out of there and the day finished, and I got to see the images and how they told the world exactly what was going on. And that kind of snapped me back into reality. And I said, this is what I've been working my whole life for. I wanted to record history, and here I am. So like I had to kind of check myself and say, like it's okay to have these feelings, but like I need to make a decision. Am I going to continue to be in this line of work, or should I just step away? And after having a good talk with myself, I was pretty proud of the work that we all did, and I'm not just talking about AP or myself, but I'm talking about the collective images that came out of the U.S. Capitol and its surroundings on January 6th from everybody, newspapers, freelancers, wire services, TV stations, and just your average bystander with a camera, tells a whole beautiful story of what happened that day. I mean, it's not a beautiful event, but when you look at it, how everybody contributed to recording history really made me super happy about that. The day ended, and like I said, John did get attacked, and maybe later on we can see that video, but and which is what made me super scared, seeing my teammate get attacked. But at the end of the day, we were all safe and sound, and our goal to tell history continued.
Thank you for that presentation, Julio. Your pictures were really powerful. So I want to begin our question session. I know that to the panelists, I sent you some questions. I'm going to jump around a bit so we leave plenty of time to let the audience ask some questions as well. So Lucy, I want to start with you. If we could go back to Ukraine, and if you could just tell us some of the unique challenges that reporters on the ground there are facing that perhaps are different or unprecedented compared to previous conflicts or unrest that we've seen elsewhere.
Thank you, Lauren, and Nicole and Julio. I was transfixed by both of your presentations. Thank you so much for your incredible work. So in terms of where we are with Ukraine, Lauren, you said at the beginning of this talk that this is the largest ground war that Europe has seen since the Second World War. So in many ways, that is the unprecedented or the new conditions that journalists of this generation and of this century are dealing with right now. We at CPJ look at safety in 3 overlapping ways, and both Nicole and Julio have touched on those a bit already, but I'll just go through them quickly with regards to this conflict. So from a physical security perspective, it seems like a fairly traditional air quotes there, conflict. So in terms of the preparation journalists have undergone, ideally with a HEFAT or hostile environment first aid training, other types of safety training as well involving physical safety or their first aid. One thing actually that I will flag is the issue around PPE or personal protective equipment. We at CPJ have received an unbelievable number of requests for this equipment. I'm talking about helmets, flak jackets, Kevlar vests, etc. I think this, you know, journalists going into Iraq and journalists who have covered wars in other parts of the world, this is standard practice, obviously. But I think for many journalists who are covering conflict like this for the first time, it's been quite disturbing to see actually the lack of PPE. And we know from our partner organizations that there is a huge backlog of equipment as well. So that's really, really worrying. But hopefully it's something that will get sorted out fairly soon. In terms of digital safety, again, this is mainly a conflict that involves one's physical safety, but of course we have to consider here the amount of misinformation and you know, Russian misinformation that is coming into all of this. I don't, you know, it's possible that newsrooms or individual journalists will face cyber attacks. I think it's a little early at this point to really go into that, although we do know that journalists who are covering Russia, whether it is this particular conflict or other stories, they do face, you know, phishing attempts, etc. And we've seen those over the past few weeks. Then we're going to talk a little bit about psychological safety, or what we call psychosocial safety as well. Obviously, for journalists who are, you know, Ukrainian journalists in Ukraine who are covering this, they probably haven't slept for 3 weeks or longer. They are covering the biggest story in the world right now that the world's attention is still on, thankfully. They probably have not been able to process everything that's happening around them. Some of them have to be uprooted and moved elsewhere. And then for those international journalists who are there as well, of course, whether we're talking about this particular conflict, or Nicole, your work in Iraq and back home, Julio, your work in Minneapolis, and of course January the 6th, these are overwhelming events that we are looking at history, we're recording history and true human suffering. And so it's after the fact that when we're home, that's when, you know, we start to process those feelings. So we always look at all 3 at the same time.
Great, thank you. Nicole, I want to go to you. For the photojournalists who are on the ground right now, what are some of the risk calculations that they're having to make in a place like Ukraine, where there aren't traditional embeds, you know, when they're trying to report and tell the story, but also there isn't a clear, safe place for them to be. So how do you do that reporting?
Yeah, thank you. Well, one thing I will say is that, you know, I'm speaking from a somewhat of a place of what friends have told me, because in my career I was only in embed, except for you know, more like earthquakes and hurricanes and things like that. But in terms of conflict, that was my experience. But from what I'm hearing, I think to tee off of what Julio said, folks are working together in teams. And just, you know, to step back a little bit, I will say, if you want to be a war tourist and go and cover a conflict and you have never covered a conflict before, this is not the time to start experimenting. Please stay away. For, you know, the love of God, please stay away. This is not a way to earn some stripes on your you know, photojournalism you know, career. This is, you know, people's lives are at stake. You're putting people's lives at risk if they have to take care of you because you don't know what you're doing. And, so that's my one PSA. This is not about, getting your, cool kid stripes. This is a time that it is incredibly essential that there's a free independent press of professionals that know what they're doing and that they can make the work in a way that is ideally helping rather than hurting. And by helping rather than hurting, that's shedding a light on this horrible humanitarian disaster that is happening and not making the story about yourself because you decided to parachute into a place that you're unprepared to be in. So I will say that right away and try to get back to your question. But that's my little soapbox thing. It just frightens me when I see, I'm going to, and I think that's very scary. But yeah, I think mostly folks have had a lot of experience. I think even folks with a lot of experience are very scared by this particular conflict because the folks who have the weapons are much more trained and the weapons are much more sophisticated. So this is probably the most dangerous conflict to be a photographer in our lifetimes. And I think that that is incredibly scary. And I think folks are working very hard to make smart decisions about when they cover what they cover. And that's why you're not seeing a lot of photos of, Russian tanks, except for when they're disabled, right? Right now, people are being smart about how they cover this conflict and so that they can be alive to continue to cover this conflict, I think. And you see that in the pictures that you're seeing. And as a viewer, it's important to take that process in. That does not mean that most Russian tanks are burnt up and disabled, right? It means that that's when it was safe to go out and safer to go out and take a picture. And so, it's really important to be a visually literate consumer of the news that you're seeing because these images are made with those risk calculations in mind. And then there's going to be tragic events that happen, like, what Lindsay witnessed and what the AP videographer witnessed, where folks are being targeted and you aren't able to make risk assessments because people are, targeting civilians, and the rules of this war are completely different. And we saw this happen in Haiti when journalists started getting, back in the 90s, when journalists could feel pretty impervious to being targets. And now that is not the paradigm that we're dealing with. So they have a whole other level of risk that they have to, take into account before they begin to report. There's no sort of safety floating between two sides anymore.
Thanks, you're absolutely right. Julio, I want to talk about that video that you had mentioned from January 6th, and maybe you can share it with us and then tell us how you de-escalated that situation, which could have become, really, really scary.
Sure. Just give me 1 second here and I'll bring up the video. Let's see. Yep.
And you're not seeing it. You're organized. Get the fuck out. Get the fuck out here. Calm down. Hey. Calm down. Hey. Get out of here. I got him. Okay. All right. Get the fuck out of here. I got him. Get the fuck out. Get out. Get the fuck out of here. Get the fuck out of here. No, he's not. He's not in. Are you in Tifa? You in Tifa? No, he's not. He's come on, guys. Come on. Are you in Tifa? You're not in Tifa? You want to come with me? Come on. We'll watch you out. Let's go. Let's go. Get out of here, dude. Come with me. Stop. Make way. Stop. I'm not going to push you over. Let him out. Let's go. Come on. Let him out. Move.
So yeah, that's really scary to see. Every time I see it, it just I'm incredibly grateful that we were okay. I'm grateful for the two men at the end who kind of intervened and got us out of there. But that situation just kind of happened, in a split second. We were photographing a lot of conflict, a lot of fighting. You saw those in the images. There was some fist fighting between the protesters and the cops. And so at that point, the attention was on that. But there's a picture where there's the smoke, and then the cops are there kind of lined up. At that moment, they had kind of pushed the protesters back, which infuriated them. And in turn, they decided to start picking on journalists. And so when they grabbed John, there you can see in the video, I pause. What do I do? And growing up in Southern California, going to the beach all the time, it kind of that came into play on its own, because I've always told, if your buddy gets caught in a rip current, you never chase, because you're gonna get sucked in too. So I'm thinking, all right, I need to kind of count my Mississippis before I can get in. And when they started pulling them to the left, I decided to go through the crowd to kind of come in from another angle and not draw attention to myself, and essentially jumped in between them. My initial goal was to get to them and grab John and kind of pull him towards the cops, and maybe the cops saw that they were beating up on the journalists and they could kind of intervene. But just as I was getting ready to grab him, they pulled him down the stairs again and pull him down. So at that point, I'm like, all right, I need to kind of get in between. And they always say, don't give your back to your aggressors. But at this point, I had the advantage that they didn't know I was, against them, or not with them, I guess is a better way of putting it. So I just kind of put myself in between. And the one time I did look at somebody, I kind of grabbed John by the shoulder and I said, I got him. I'm going to get him out of here. And the guy backed off. He's like, all right, cool. Like, he's going to go beat him up. I don't have to deal with it. And that worked for a second until somebody shouted out that he was Antifa and kind of gaslit the situation again, in which wound up, leading to him being thrown over that ledge. But that ledge actually, I think, became a really good barrier because it kept them off. And those two men that came in to our rescue, just kind of, the guy grabbed me, and you can hear him in my ear telling me, I'm not going to hurt you. I'm going to push you. I'm going to get you out of here. He looked trained. He looked like this was something that he knew how to do, how to, get somebody out of a situation. So it all just kind of lined up perfectly. But, it all of it just happened in a split second. I mean, that video is 1 minute and 30 seconds, which sounds like a long time, but when you're in the middle of it, it's now. It's just you blink and you're over the ledge.
Yeah, I think that video definitely shows, in real time, the value of always being with someone, even if you're experienced, if you've been in these types of situations before. You never know what can happen, and you might need someone, a partner there, to literally get you out of a really dangerous situation. So thank you for sharing that. Lucy, I want to jump over to you and ask you what kind of challenges you see for journalists in the future when it comes to covering war and unrest.
Absolutely. Thank you, Lauren. Julio, I think that video should be shown in every journalism school, frankly, because it is an incredible piece of history, number one, but also, just as you described, ways to de-escalate situations that get out of hand. When we're thinking about the future of covering war and conflict, I think that just more training and more talks and education within newsrooms with journalists around the very specific things you need to do to be able to cover these situations is absolutely crucial. Over the past 2 years, there have been so many new challenges for journalists in the US, at least, in terms of covering things that are dangerous and very scary, as both Julio and Nicole have mentioned. Wildfires, of course, being one. Protests across the country where you had local journalists who had never had to cover any type of protest that was really that big with a militarized police force. And additionally, across the country, we saw journalists being arrested while and after they had announced themselves as press, they had shown their press credentials. This happened across the country, and that is extremely worrying and an erosion of norms for sure. So I think we can learn certainly from the protests here in the US and the situation in Ukraine, making sure that newsrooms that are sending journalists in at least are properly prepared, whether that is with training or with equipment, and just making sure that journalists are able to access those things at the ready. For freelancers and independent journalists, it is of course a different situation. Julio, you mentioned always being with someone. That's crucially important. If you're a freelancer, that would ideally be with other freelancers. We know in Ukraine that there are people there on their own, and that is not ideal. So at the very least, whether you're in a war zone or in a protest, linking up with others is just really standard good practice. Doing a risk assessment is something that CPJ always encourages as well, just so in your mind, the assignment you're about to go under, here are all the things that could possibly happen. But also here's how myself as a journalist can use my identity and my experience to make a positive, to have this be a positive experience as well. It's not always negative. I think being aware that globally and in different situations, the role, like the press and media, are disliked. We just saw that in Julio's video. We heard fake news. We saw in Ukraine with the Sky News video I just mentioned, we saw the journalists yelling, journalist, journalist, British journalist. Whether they couldn't hear those reporters or what have you, it's good to just be aware that sometimes in certain situations, and it completely depends on the situation, identifying yourself as press can be a good thing or a bad thing, right? And it totally depends on the situation. But again, being aware of this kind of global context when it comes to the role of the press and what people think. And then finally, always being really up to date on one's digital safety. I could speak about that for a long time and I won't, but it is a crucial part actually of covering conflict or unrest and unrest. People don't always like their photos being taken. I'm sure Julio and Nicole can both speak to that at length, but we saw many examples during the protests of the summer of 2020 where journalists and photographers were harassed online after the pictures they made and the reports they published went public. So always important to consider that as well.
Thanks, Lucy. I'm going to pose a question each to Nicole and Julio, and then we'll move over to some of these great questions we're getting in from the audience. Nicole, you had mentioned that you had done an embed, and we know that in February, the Military Reporters and Editors Association formally petitioned the DoD, the Defense Department, to allow journalists to embed with US troops that had been deployed to NATO's eastern flank. And I can just preempt this and say that, you know, as the editor of Afghanistan in the last few years of the war, DoD had essentially denied almost all embeds. It was incredibly difficult for journalists to be allowed to embed with troops. So I think that this was a really important move, but I would love if you could just talk a little bit about how the DoD, if they've responded to this, and more broadly, the importance of allowing journalists to embed with the US military or any military.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm not super familiar on where they are with the ask at the moment, but I can say that the military censoring their involvement in the war by not allowing journalists to access the war does a disservice to everyone, including the military. And the lack of transparency is incredibly short-sighted. I found in my personal experience in Iraq, but working in a town that was full of military members, the nickname of San Antonio is Military City. It's got tremendously large bases and has a vigorous retirement community of military. So our newspaper readership was military folks, and our coverage of the war as in-bed journalists and that sort of Ernie Pyle tradition meant a lot to the community. And there were just a lot of families and schools that, felt like they could understand the returning soldiers' experience so much better because they could see it, and the soldiers want to not talk about their experiences. So as a public service, it really did make a difference to, I think, not only the families of the service members, but the service members themselves, because they didn't have to explain. They were shown, their stories were shown, and that had a tremendous impact, I think, for the community. I think the perfect example is when the Obama administration reversed the policy of showing the caskets coming home in the dignified transfers. So I met so many, Gold Star families who felt that no one understood what they had gone through, and they were exhausted from having the trauma of living and having to explain it. But when pictures are made available, people feel seen and they feel like their stories are being shared, and then people can empathize with them and connect with them. And so there's just tremendous value and importance to not only hold leaders accountable for mistakes and decisions that they make that put American lives at risk. It's also incredibly important to build a national understanding of where we are and what is being lost and what is being sacrificed. And I think it's so incredibly important. I believe in it very much. And one quick thing I just wanted to say too as well is I don't know if we'll talk about this later, but when we were talking about the unilateral thing, one thing that is super important to understand is that a lot of these folks in these big organizations have security teams, and those aren't seen in the pictures, but that is a really important part of the process. They also have local reporters helping them and local folks who are helping enable the coverage. And I was in Brazil once. It wasn't even a military situation. Was photographing an unsheltered movement, and the guy that I was working with, who was a local photographer, he said to me, "We got to get out of here. We got to get out of here." I'm so mad. I was finally making pictures, and but I trusted him because he was a local, and he said, "We got to get out of there." 30 minutes later, another photographer was stabbed to death. This guy saved my life. He read the room. I had no idea. I was pissing people off, or that there was a mood change, because I don't speak Portuguese, and I didn't get the social cues in the same way that he did. And there's just so much stuff that goes on for folks who are, doing these conflict zones year after year. They trust the people that they work with, and it is a team effort.
Absolutely. I can say that the times for all of our correspondents and photographers on the ground right now, there are security advisors attached to each of them, making decisions about when to stay, when to go. And sometimes that decision is we have to stay because leaving is actually more dangerous because of the path. But there is a really big team that's having to make those really tough decisions every day. And it's a very much of an institution effort to do this kind of reporting. And so maybe something we can get into a little bit later is, the greater risk for freelancers who don't have the luxury and the protection of a security team. And as we've seen, more institutions have to kind of cut back on their foreign bureaus. They've relied more on freelancers to go in and pick up that risk without the security attached to them. And so that is a bigger issue facing journalism and the industry as a whole right now. But I want to jump over to you, Julio. Maybe you could talk about when you were in Minneapolis after that first day, how did you prepare? Like, how were you preparing to go out every day? What were you wearing? And how were you filing? Did you have to go back to a computer every day? Are you filing? There's a question, can you file right from your phone, from your camera? I think it would help people just understand the process of getting ready to go into one of these environments.
Yeah, number one, when I was told to go to Minneapolis, my first question to my manager was, can you get me a vest? Because as a sports photographer, you don't ever need it, and it never dawned at me to wear one at protests until, like I said earlier, I saw Carlos's pictures, and I'm like, this is really violent. I need to get a vest, and so they found me one in DC, and so on my way to Minneapolis, I flew out of DC and picked up not just one for myself, but one for John, so we can have, and that helped a lot. Unfortunately, it's summer in Minneapolis and it's hot, and so you can't really conceal the vest. So there was a lot of moments when people thought I was an undercover cop, and I had to just kind of, show them my cameras and show them my credential and say, no, I'm just a photographer. I work for the AP. If you have your phone, go to my Instagram, you see, my pictures, and a lot of them just kind of, all right, cool, that's good enough. And so, but I think a lot of the questions came because I was wearing a helmet. At that point, it was just like a climbing helmet and this mask, the same one that John was wearing in that video. It's just a full shield mask with two filters, and so it looks pretty professional. So people were asking about that. On top of that, I carry a first aid kit with a tourniquet, and one thing that that I always tell students, that even if you can't get a mask, get some of these pads. There's pads that you can get from Amazon that will help you in a pinch. They're not the greatest protection, but if you ever get sprayed with pepper spray or whatnot, you just wipe your face with it, and within minutes you're okay. So that's I carry a lot of that. My cameras, I usually try to dumbing them down. So with the Sonys, it's great because you can take the grip off, and so it doesn't make you look as professional, and it kind of makes you move in and out easy. That's exactly what I had on January 6th, and I think people weren't taking me too serious with two what looked like consumer cameras. I also on January 6th, I wore gray pants and a brown jacket, so kind of just a middle of the ground colors to not not stick out, which part of the commentary on John is he was wearing all black, and that may be the reason why they mistook him. In any case, I always think about the proper clothing. And finally, to answer your question about the cameras, back when I was in Minneapolis, I was using Canons, and you can same with any camera now, any of the pro cameras, you can send the images directly from your camera to an FTP account using either the built-in Wi-Fi or some sort of Mi-Fi device that you carry with you. That picture of the upside down flag, I said earlier, I made it at 11:59:38 seconds. So I flagged my editor who was editing me that night, Kim Johnson in Chicago, and I said, are you still up? Because more stuff is coming, and I think you should look at this. And I think there was a consecutive text replies that just said WOW, WOW, like, she was just like, wow. So I think she texted me maybe 5-7 minutes after I had sent that picture, and she's like, all right, the world's seeing that image now. So that's the reason why it kind of spread like wildfire, because it was out there right when people were paying attention the most. So same on January 6th. I didn't send a lot of pictures from my camera, mostly because the bandwidth was very tight, and couldn't send too much, but I did send a handful that were out on the wire. I remember somebody texted me saying, hey, your photo is on the front page of the New York Times right now. Good job. And at that point, I'm not caring about that. I'm just caring that, okay, the pictures are on the wire, and we're doing our job.
Thanks. So now I want to go to questions from the audience. We've already seen a few, but if you have questions now, feel free to drop them in the chat. And some of these are specific, some of them I'll just toss out there and you guys can all feel free to answer. The first question is, for people who want to cover conflict zones but have not started that journey yet, how do you do that responsibly in a way that you're not putting yourself or others in danger? What is the right career path to become a combat correspondent? Nicole, why don't you start?
Sure. Well, I would recommend hostile environment training as a way to start thinking about the issues, to get some first aid training, and to put yourself in some scenarios that would simulate the stress of being in a hostile environment or a conflict zone. I think that educating yourself is always a really important start, and it's better to do that than to just try to parachute in and learn on the ground. There's some things where that's appropriate, but with your own health and the safety of others, I think like DART offers really great opportunities. If you're within an organization, your organization can fund it as well, but freelancers definitely have several options, and I'm sure Lucy could speak to some more. I think the Warren Buffett Foundation has a women's initiative for women to do it, and I can't emphasize enough how important it is to have diverse voices telling the stories of conflict, and so even though I was saying don't go, I think it is important that you get trained, and that many perspectives are represented as the people who are helping tell these stories. And then I would also just point out, in terms of equipment and things like that, it's very difficult to see working in this gear. Helmets and goggles and those sorts of things. You already have limited visibility as a photojournalist because your eye is in the camera. You can't see you don't, even though you're supposed to keep your head and swivel in these conflict zones, you often have bad periphery vision because you're focused forward. And so definitely figuring out ways to work together with others and sort of tag team safety is also super important. And I would say don't go to the biggest thing in the world. Start slow. Actually, Julio's sports background, some of the best conflict photographers out there hone their skills and their ability to react in a split second by starting as sports photographers. I think hand-eye coordination, working on things that build those skills is very important. Working on your critical thinking skills. When you're, in an everyday situation, like covering a normal protest, not the crazy Minneapolis con, but just like, a rally, where would my exit be? And working through those sorts of scenarios, even though you're not going to need it, but just working your brain to start thinking through that, so that when you are in those situations, it's automatic. It's automatic. You know what to do. And that's what happened with Julio when he got in trouble. with that walkout situation, he already had his exit planned because he was thinking that way. And it's a little wiggy to like be that person in a restaurant who doesn't want to sit with their back to the windows. But you never know. I mean, that it could be the day that really comes in handy. Or here in California, the earthquake could happen, and you're going to be really grateful that you were thinking like that on an ordinary basis. All of those skills translate to conflict zones.
Lucy, anything you want to add on that?
Yeah, just in terms of where training is available, yes, DART does some, Nicole. There's also a fantastic, and I'll put a link in the chat, a fantastic organization called the ACOS Alliance, stands for A Culture of Safety. This organization was founded to help freelancers who are in conflict zones and lack that traditional newsroom security support. And also the IWMF, the International Women's Media Foundation, they regularly do HEFAT trainings here in the US and in other countries. So I'll pop links to both of those so you can find out more.
Is the Rory Peck Trust, is that the other one I was
And
trying
the Rory Peck Trust is indeed another one. Yes.
Yeah,
So
good stuff.
I'll put them in.
Thank you. Another question from our audience: are there any new services or individuals that are using drones in Ukraine right now or elsewhere? I'm not sure.
I'm not aware of any personally.
I believe both we have two photographers in Ukraine, Filipa Dana and Emilio Morinati, who've had some images that show an aerial perspective, and I'm not really sure. I'm just speculating that they're from drones, but those are two photographers who use the drone quite often. So I would say yes, but I'm not seeing too much of the content right now.
I imagine that they're probably very good in areas where there has been fighting and the danger has since passed and going to assess the damage, but you wouldn't necessarily want to be using a drone in a kinetic environment. They're very expensive. They could draw attention to you. But it is interesting how they've been used in, other periods of unrest or conflicts that we've seen recently. Other questions? Let's see. There's a question here about to Nicole or Julio about if there's anything you wanted to comment on the death of Chauncey Bailey, who was the editor-in-chief and a Black man who was shot dead in 2007 by a crime syndicate he was investigating.
I got to California after Chauncey's death. I mean, I'll just say that obviously the work is incredibly dangerous, and I think I think we all know that that there's a possibility that the wrong people are going to take offense at your work, and it's incredibly tragic whenever a journalist pays the ultimate price for their work. I can't say enough about how how terrible that is. I know in general for us, crime in Oakland, is a significant concern. Crime in the Bay Area in general is a significant concern. I know that this is more specifically targeted, but just in general. And so it's definitely something that we think about all the time and try to think through how important is it to cover things when we're going to cover it, and how are we going to cover it, and sort of using some of that situational awareness that we talked about in translating it to just an area that is very unforgiving for photographers to make mistakes in these days.
Thank you. Are there times when identifying yourself as a member of the press is actually more dangerous than trying to be conspicuous? I think we saw that with January 6th, but are there other experiences that either any of you have had where that, it's actually been better not to be wearing, a press, something that clearly says press or identifies you as press?
So for me, now I normally wear my credential on my neck the way I would normally wear it, except it's facing backwards. And the reason I do that is, you know, just if somebody wants to see it, I can quickly turn it over and show it to them. But it's not, you know, freely advertised. And the reason I do that is in 2013, September 2013, actually some colleagues were starting to call me 11th because I was covering the 10th homicide in 10 days in Newark, New Jersey. And I was going to be 11th. And I was just standing outside of this projects covering the homicide of a 14-year-old. And a man came who I've seen throughout the day. And in fact, I photographed him earlier as part of the crowd, came up to me and held my credential and looked at the picture. And he said, "I've seen you before." And I thought he was joking. And long story short, he confused me with somebody else. And without, you know, thinking twice, while he's talking to me, he pulled out a knife and swung it at me and almost stabbed me. And luckily, I was able to kind of de-escalate that situation. And a newspaper photographer, Bob Sherino from the Newark Star Ledger, was inside of a bodega just 2 steps away. And I went and found him and I said, "I need your help." And he was like, what's going on? I was like, somebody just tried to stab me. And so when we came out of the bodega, since there was 2 of us, this person kind of turned his I guess his persona went back to like just a normal guy. And I'm like, yeah, that doesn't look like, you know, somebody that once wanted to stab me, but he just did. And I'm going to get out of here. I suggest you do too. So now as a result, I always wear the credential backwards. On January 6th, I had it backwards, but inside my jacket. And again, should, you know, cops or anybody of authority would say, "Who are you?" I can pull it out. But you know, that's just my style now.
Yeah, I think that's really good too, because the lanyard can also be used as a way of taking you down. And so it's tricky. Like, you need to be able to identify yourself, because the police are so apt to say, "Oh, well, they weren't wearing a credential, so I'm going to arrest them." But at the same time, it also leaves you really vulnerable to someone using it as a tool for attack. So it's a tricky situation for sure.
We sometimes say to use an armband, so similar to one that you'd wear when exercising, that you keep your phone in. At least that way it can't be pulled, but you're still kind of visible, and you can also cover it if you need to as well.
Sorry, I started talking while still muted. So between, you know, embeds being more difficult to obtain, violence against the press, you know, the rise of claims of fake news, the industry in general having to contract, and seeing fewer foreign bureaus, even local and national papers drying up. Is this media environment changing your opinion about being a journalist? And this will be our last question. So each of you, I'd love if you could give us an answer. Lucy, why don't you start?
Sure. So being a more traditional journalist before my role at CPJ, one of the reasons I joined CPJ was because I could see, at least here in the US, how things were changing for journalists, right? And there was suddenly, you had to worry about your safety more, and there was a rise in things like fake news, enemy of the people, etc. It has certainly opened my eyes, and I feel now that with so much knowledge, and including all the work that CPJ does for journalists around the world, I would feel very safe doing my job. But I think now is a more important time than ever to be a journalist, and I would not change the job for the world. But you really do have to be prepared now in many, many different ways. And the war in Ukraine only strengthens that resolve, because we need the journalists there to tell the rest of the world what is going on.
Thank you. What about you, Nicole?
Yeah, I absolutely agree. I mean, I started, my career as a young person who wanted to be an artist and a photographer, and the journalist part came later for me. And now the journalist part is the most important part. I am, after living through the US's involvement in, these long-running wars and the emergence of the alt-right, and now Ukraine, I feel like people's ability to get independent information is 100% under threat. And I am really driven to give people the best possible information so that they can make decisions. And I think that there's no better way to do that than the combination of words and pictures. It's a very powerful medium. And it has the ability to really shape policy and change hearts and minds. And I think that we owe it to the world to keep on doing what we're doing, because no matter what the threat is, without it, we're doomed.
Yeah, you're right. Julio, what about you?
I think I said it the best way I could say it earlier when that night of January 6th, when I had to check myself, do I really want to do this? Is this something for me? And yeah, of course, I think I have the luxury of working for the most, down the middle organization, that sets the standard for, unbiased, truthful coverage, which really helps. And so my goal is to keep that prestige going and do my part with this. So yeah, it was scary, but here we are. We're going to continue doing it.
Well, thank you. Thanks to all of you for being here today and for your insight. And this has been a wonderful panel. And I know that for the audience there, we have been a lot of links dropped in where you can find information. And thank you again for being here.
Yeah, thank you, Lauren. Thank you to all our panelists. This is sort of the all-star team of conflict journalists, and in a society where the word hero is used for just about everything, you guys deserve that title for the work that you do and continue to do. So I want to thank you once again. I know people have, just from the notes in the chat, people have learned a great deal from our time this afternoon. Thanks to the California State Library, and especially to the Zoom team behind the scenes. It's pretty much a flawless presentation, and I thank you for that. And several organizations have supported our efforts today, mostly by helping to spread the word about our panel. And those include the Associated Press, the Committee to Protect Journalists, the New Jersey chapter of the Society of Professional Journalists, the New York Times, and the San Francisco Chronicle. So thanks to them, thanks to our panel and all of you who Zoomed in today. Have a great weekend and stay safe. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.